Welcome to the Something to Gnaw On podcast, a parable-style devotional designed to give you something to mentally or spiritually gnaw on throughout your day. And I'm your host, Nate Vinio. This week's episode is a continuation of King Ahaz and a rescue message. But first, a few details about the upcoming weeks and some special episodes. A few weeks ago, I made a lighthearted reference to my gold mining days in Montana, and a quick picture of some of the colorful characters I worked with, like a guy named Duke, who I didn't mention last time, but he's as emblematic of the group as anyone. One day we broke for lunch, and 12 of us met at the boss's cabin for a special lunch. Most of us were seated around the table, but a couple of guys were standing in the corners, eating their food. It was a relaxed and jovial time of smiling, laughing, and cutting up, that is, until Duke walked in. Duke was certainly the only man or authority in his own world. He waltzed into the cabin, donning his Aussie hat and a brand-new nickel-plated .44 revolver slung around his hip like a Western-style gunfighter. He had a jovial skip in his step and was looking forward to the moment when he could share his newest purchase with the rest of the crew. As he sat down and before serving up any food for himself, he had the gun out on the table, showing off the right side of the gun to everybody like a model on The Price is Right, then the left side, then the top, then opening and spinning the cylinder, which was loaded as everyone expected. Have you ever watched a Seattle Seahawks football game? The fans do this thing called the wave. Simply put, the fans stand up and sit back down in a sequential fashion that at a distance it looks like a wave is moving through the stadium. Well, as Duke began to show off that .44, that's what the 12-man lunch bunch looked like, everyone subtly ducking and leaning when the barrel was pointing their direction. Duke was quite the personality and quite the source of drama at the mine, as were several others. And I've wanted to talk about this season of my life for some time. There are a lot of lessons to learn here, but I haven't known what the best way to break into this box of stories would be. So last week, I recorded a conversation with my friend Daniel Moore of the Connecting the Gap podcast, and we have what will be a two-part conversation about sharing your faith in the workplace, where this season of my life is front and center. Now, a quick point of clarity here. Daniel and I also did a two-part series recently regarding the importance of Bible study, which I would obviously encourage you to listen to, but be aware. There will be a total of 4 episodes that I'm doing on Connecting the Gap, and the last 2 will be related to these gold mining days. Now, as it relates to our study about Ahaz and the rescue message about being careful and being quiet, not fearing, not losing heart, and that message that Isaiah shares with him at the upper pool, which we referred to as Ahaz's hurting place, that place of pain and vulnerability. There's an additional detail I want to share with you from the mine to kick off this episode. When I started at the mine, I literally started at the bottom rung, but I quickly moved up the ladder. I started by cleaning the shop and then graduated to a shovel and a pick, then to driving a loader and a bobcat and an excavator and a 30-ton haul truck. After perpetually quizzing the geologist about what we were looking for and what we were finding, keeping notes, mapping locations, and memorizing assaying values, which is somewhat of a curse more than a gift or hard work on my part. But after a few months of this, I was tasked to take hold of what they called quality control. And this is where some of our miners gave me the nickname, the Professor. This new position was a way of saying that I would be officially in charge of taking samples, getting them to the assayer, charting values, and keeping the high-grade gold ore separated from the mid-grade or low-grade gold ore, and sending official reports to the owner and the investors. One of the interesting and ongoing conversations I would have with the geologist was not just about gold, but how to read the soil to know if we were getting close. There were signs in the soil that would give good indications regarding the presence of gold. One detail I would add that would be important for people to understand regarding gold mining where we were at was that we never saw gold. Oh, we found lots of gold, but we never saw it. You might call it mining blind. This wasn't the gold mining show that you would find on the Discovery Channel up in Alaska where they were finding nuggets or flakes. This was gold mining in particle form, and you would never see it with the naked eye. But if you found quartz with what the miners called gouge, which was a deep red, almost brick red substance, or a thing the old-timers called goat's beard, which was a light green, almost yellow substance in the quartz, or what the geologists called malachite, which is almost the same color green as the Statue of Liberty, or azurite, which is a majestic dark blue found in the quartz, or maybe you find petsite, which to me looked like an old nasty silver tooth filling. If we saw these things, we knew that there would be tiny particles of gold which could be extracted through the milling process. So it became my duty, when we found the gouge or the goat's beard or the malachite or the azurite or the petsite or anything else that seemed similar in nature, it was my duty to sample it and get it to the assayer to get a gold measurement per ton. Now trust me, this does relate to Ahaz. We'll get there in a minute. I would take several 25-pound bags of gold ore from the sample area to a guy in Deer Lodge who would crush the entire 25 pounds into a fine sand-like mesh. He would proceed to mix up the sandy mesh as if he was creating some kind of bakery recipe. He would then take several samples into small glass-like cones, like a pointed ice cream sugar cone, and he'd put it into a furnace that, if memory serves me correctly, would heat up to about 3,500 degrees. In this process, it would create a molten sample. The heaviest materials, the gold, would settle to the bottom. When the sample would cool and harden, the assayer would take the cone and measure the amount of gold at the tip. And with a simple mathematical calculation, he would give us a value of gold per ton that we could expect. Or perhaps, more simply put, for every ton of dirt with gouge or goat's beard or malachite or azurite or petsite that we pulled out of the ground in the sample area, we would know with confidence that we would get or should get X ounces of gold or Y ounces of silver. It is this assay report that confirms with certainty that what we visually observed indicated the presence of what was otherwise hidden. In this exchange in Isaiah 7, where God reaches out to Ahaz through Isaiah and his son, this message comes where God gives a promise that the kings of the north, Rezin and Pekah, won't be successful in their attack. But it also comes with a command, a challenge to be careful, to be quiet. Don't fear, don't lose heart. And last week we looked at the be careful statement, and this week I want to dig a little deeper into that before we move forward. To dumb down this word to Ahaz a bit and put it into perspective, think of the statement of being careful and being quiet like the gouge or the goat's beard or the malachite or the azurite. When you see these careful or, dare I say, careless disciplines in effect, there are other things that follow that you might not be able to see with the naked eye, like peace as opposed to fear, and courage as opposed to a faint heart. If you see careless behavior in someone who can't keep their mouth shut, you'll find that kind of behavior will have a cumulative effect of stress and drama that will result in fear and anxiety, and over time will eventually cause a person to lose heart. Anxiety will own this person. Conversely, it's easy to argue that if a person is careful about their behavior, their decisions, their choices, they significantly reduce the situations in life in which they should be fearful or could be fearful. In this passage, God is clear that He's going to take care of the kings from the north. He's got that under control. The charge to Ahaz is to be careful, so as to not create more of a mess. One of the hardest things for the human being to do is to be still and quiet and let God work. If ever there was a guy who could draw this out and highlight both sides, it would be Solomon. I'm working on this on the 22nd of May, so I thought I would see what Proverbs 22 has to say about any of this. And for some of you, if you're caught off guard by this highly seasoned form of script-dip Bible study, there's a lot of people out there who read one chapter in Proverbs per day, as there are only 31 chapters, and it makes a perfect fit for the month. So I thought I would see if Solomon, in all his wisdom, just might happen to address this topic in chapter 22. And he did not disappoint. You could probably find references to this in any chapter for that matter, but for today, here's what he says about things related to being careful and being quiet in verses 3 and 4. Quote, "A prudent man foresees danger and takes precaution." Sounds like that falls into the category of being careful. And now, in contrast, quote, "The simpleton goes on blindly and suffers the consequences." Sounds like a bit of fear is in store for the simpleton and his carelessness. And again, that's verse 3. Quick look at verse 4. Quote, "True humility and fear of the Lord," which sounds akin to being careful, "this leads to riches and honor and a long life," which, in contrast again, this doesn't sound like fear or a person who will be losing heart from being fearful anytime soon. Again, that's verse 4. When you read through Proverbs, you can't help but get hit by this truth. Call it wisdom, call it being prudent, call it being careful, call it seeking counsel. Solomon calls it wisdom. Isaiah says, "Be careful." When you get to the New Testament, you see Peter use some interesting verbiage to say the same thing that Isaiah does. Quote, "Dear friends, I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very soul. Be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior and give honor to God when He judges the world." You can find that in 1 Peter 2, verses 11 and 12. So I ask the question, if you're living carefully, what do you have to fear? Up until now, I have spoken in pretty broad and theoretical strokes about what careful is. How about we take a look at a list of careless behaviors? This is just a scattered list of careless behaviors listed by the Apostle Paul and James, the brother of Jesus. As I read through this, and as a means of self-reflection, not at all an issue of condemnation, but ask the Lord if any of these are areas in your life where you need to be careful. Whether these are indicators, if you will, of the source of fear or anxiety in your life. Here's the list. Deceit, the bending or twisting of truth or misguiding people. Hypocrisy, doing something for the sake of convenience or benefit in one situation, although it undermines a core belief. Jealousy, wishing that you had the benefit of someone else's hard work or choices. Unkind speech, pretty self-evident. Any kind of immorality, no matter how right or justifiable it may feel or seem in a moment or season. Idolatry, making something effectively more important than God. What about sorcery or hostility or quarreling or jealousy or dissensions or creating dissensions or divisions? How about social media? It's made it so easy. It's so easy to take a jab or take a moral swing at somebody publicly and broadcast information that, irrespective of its truth or accuracy, shouldn't be anything that the general public or the general church body needs to know or be aware of, or to be even thinking about. It shouldn't even be on their radar. I never thought I would quote Mike Tyson on this podcast, but social media has made people soft to think they can say something without getting punched in the face. Of course, that's a loose translation of none other than Mike Tyson, but used to be that the church gossip used to call 50 people on the prayer chain on a rotary dial phone just to get the church to split. Now all it takes is one clever or, dare I say, ignorant post on social media. Okay, I'm off of the list here, of course, but let's get back to it. What about careless things like envy, drunkenness, outbursts of anger, or wild partying. You can find these listed out in Galatians 5 and 1 Peter 2. And of course, this is only a partial list of careless and unwise behavior. Certainly, Proverbs has a much longer list, but I jot it down simply for you to think of as gouge or goat's beard or malachite or azurite. They're indicators of the consequence and presence of a fool's gold, if you will, a result like fear and faint-heartedness that Isaiah spoke of. People who do these things do so out of a desire for control, but end up with chaos. They desire acceptance, but end up rejected. They desire personal enjoyment, but they end up paying the price in the terms of personal pain. They desire to numb the pain, but end up with an amputation. People do these things with a sense that no consequence will befall them, but they become faint-hearted as the fear builds from the consequences of their behaviors, their sinful behaviors. And dare I say that there are those who do these things out of selfish ambition. And when I think of Ahaz and his considerable list of character flaws, this phrase, selfish ambition, comes right to the top. And I'm reminded of what James has to say about it. And if there was any biblical quote in his psych profile, this would be it, quote, "For jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. Such things are earthly, unspiritual, and demonic." Right here's the linchpin. "For where there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and every kind of evil." And if it's not selling off the temple furniture to buy protection from heathen kings, maybe it's the making of foreign idols to find success outside of God's plan and without being subjected to God's law. Ahaz's Achilles' heel was that he wanted what he wanted, and he was going to get it the way he saw best, without submitting to anyone else, especially God. He was going to get what he wanted on his terms. Selfish ambition. Remember the promise of Galatians 6, quote, "Don't be misled. You cannot mock the justice of God. You will always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay," and dare I insert here, fear and faint-heartedness as a part of the process. "But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit." Again, you can find that in Galatians 6. "The devil roams like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour," Peter says. Jesus says that the devil comes to steal, kill, and destroy. It's absolutely essential to study the Scriptures, to read Proverbs, to understand what careful behavior is, and that we listen to the Holy Spirit as He directs us in real time. This issue of being careful, like Isaiah was instructing Ahaz, is not a one-time thing. It's a daily life thing. And I would add a word of brotherly caution here as well. I fear that in the growth process of the Christian, there's a stage where there's an inappropriate dependence on grace. It's tempting for someone to look at these situations I just went over, the jealousy, the envy, anger, immorality, and the whole slew of sins, and reach an inappropriate conclusion that grace covers it. And inasmuch as these sins separate us from God, yes, grace covers it. But in terms of earthly consequences of sin, it does not. If in anger and a drunken stupor a person hits and hurts someone, sure, grace makes things right between them and God in terms of the eternal consequences of sin, but the consequences of fines and medical bills and physical injury and legal expenses still remain here on earth. And this is why God's counsel to Ahaz is, be careful. Because there are basic earthly consequences to our behavior that fly way below the radar of grace. And certainly God can walk with people through such bad decisions, but wouldn't it be better if we didn't have to? What else could we accomplish if we weren't having to deal with the consequences of carelessness in our lives. These consequences eat up our time and our attention and keep us from being a part of what God is doing in a moment of victory. About 4 months ago, I had a guy walk into my store, and we struck up a pretty jovial conversation. Little did I know at the time that this interaction would trigger this whole study of Ahaz in Isaiah 7. It all started off well, but as Pekah and Rezin in the north created some fear in Ahaz, this guy and his brother began to work on me. I told my manager just a couple of days ago that I had never considered quitting or calling in sick due to a customer interaction until these two particular firebrands from the north showed up. Now, without making any judgment to their previous occupations, and they're truck drivers now, of course, my manager made the comment that the situation reminded him of working with the cartel, which neither of us have any experience with except that which we've seen in movies, and of course we filled in the gaps with our own imaginations. But nonetheless, these guys came in and threw down a large amount of money on truck parts that were largely cosmetic and seemed to have a clear expectation that they would be taken care of in the gray areas, so to speak, should any of those arise, and I was their go-to guy. No pressure, Nate. It was almost an initiation, and one of the guys was the front man and the other was the godfather, who would come in with the payment when the details were worked out. And he was quite the cool cat, fearsome, but cool and calm in that moment. Given their lack of business experience in the industry, fulfilling the order accurately and efficiently was a bit of a challenge. But over the course of a week, we got it nailed down, except that I made one mistake. At which time, I began to see another side of the brothers. Nobody wants to make a mistake, and nobody wants to run from one in the retail business. You have to correct these mistakes ASAP. And I was all over it. But it was going to require a bit of time because of the vendor. That said, we discounted and credited and paid for the next day error that would happen down the line to make amends for the correction. At the same time, we had an expectation of map reading and address skills on the behalf of the brothers from the north. And both of those last two expectations would turn out to be completely unreasonable. Needless to say, getting this corrected was a comedy of errors that the brothers didn't laugh about. And I don't fault them for that. However, I will say that the relationship got a bit caustic and hostile after that. And although they were more than 1,500 miles away, I would dread their phone calls. To this day, I religiously look at the caller ID, and I know their phone numbers by heart. I remember the verbal taunts over the phone, the threats of Big Brother not being too happy, the pseudo-friendly jabs of, "Hey, we're not feeling the love here, Nate. How can you treat us like this when we spend so much money?" Which, in their defense, was considerable in the industry, and not exactly an inaccurate statement, but there was that subtle tone of threat underneath it. And the statement was given with a sense that there was an arm over one shoulder in a brotherly love fashion while he was contemplating which rib to insert the knife between with the other hand. It was in this season that God brought me to Isaiah 7 and Ahaz. I began to pray daily at work. I would get messages to call these guys, and I would pray. And God would say, "Be careful. Be quiet. Don't fear. Don't lose heart." And I always found it ironic that these two people Ahaz feared were two firebrands from the north, and the two guys I was wrestling with were two firebrands from the north. So often in my life, I would just avoid these people. It just seemed like Proverbs 22 wisdom to avoid certain people when you can, but sometimes they find you, and you can't get loose of them. I couldn't get away from the fact that God wanted me to deal with this from start to finish. The problem is that, historically, I either avoid things like this, or I do not behave like I should in these situations. So this became another opportunity to learn how to be careful when having to deal with difficult people. I will tell you that this situation worked itself out over several weeks. When I would stop and pray, even if it was a quick prayer, I found that God would lead me in some subtle things to say or do as a way of walking me through it. And now I'll say that the most difficult part of this whole thing was keeping my mouth shut at times, the be quiet part of the rescue message. And we'll get into that in the next episode a little bit more, but it's part of being careful. And it's awfully tempting to say things when you're on the phone with someone who would have to catch 3 planes and is more than 14 hours away. But then again, this guy had the money to pay for it and the desire to make the point if he had to. So it's wise to keep said mouth shut. So in the event you're wondering how Nate even stumbled across this passage and why he's spending so much time here, remember from some of the early episodes, and that sometimes these episodes are more like journal entries. Sometimes they're more like me talking to myself than me talking to you, whoever the collective you is today. Or better yet, it's you getting to see what God is speaking to Nate about. That said, I will say this. Next episode, I will be covering this idea of be quiet, which should be a quick episode, theoretically. But as I said earlier, it's the be careful and the be quiet that naturally diffuses the issues that cause the fear and cause people to lose heart. So as a matter of practicality and time on this podcast, after the next episode, I'm planning on moving on to a couple of other themes in Isaiah 7. But I'm not going to dig into the fear or the losing heart comments of Isaiah's first comments to Ahaz here. But feel free to dig into that on your own. As I close out this episode, take hold of the illustration from my gold mining days. What you see can give you an indication of what you can't see. Gouge and goat's beard and malachite and azurite are good indicators of gold content. In the same way, there are careless behaviors that are good indicators of a fool's gold condition of the soul, where fear is rampant and faint-heartedness is not far off. So the questions for today are simply as follows. Are you committed to being careful? Committed to studying the Word to see what careful really looks like? Committed to listening to the Holy Spirit speaking to you in real time about how to be careful? The maturing Christian needs to be able to ask these types of questions in the same way that David did in Psalm 139. And we've covered it many times throughout the Something to Know On podcast already, but today's questions are basically the same as David's prayer in Psalm 139. And let me just kind of mix it up a little bit here, but maybe it would sound like this. Search me and know me. See if there be any careless ways in me, any malachite or azurite or goat's beard or gouge, and dare I add, guard me from further fear and protect me from what I cannot control, and give me the strength to be careful and act wisely. Next episode, we will continue in this interaction between Ahaz and God through his prophet Isaiah. There is still much to learn from this interaction, much to be revealed. Until next time,